Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for organizing. It's wonderful to be in New York in May. So when I told people I was coming here and the workshop was on the functions of consciousness, they would often say, "Oh, what are the functions of consciousness?" And I would always say, "I don't know," because I don't know. It's one thing I have in common with Socrates and a lot of Americans. I don't really know anything about it. But I got a paper that I wrote with Tim Bain that's coming out on how to think about the functions of consciousness. And so what I want to do is kind of foreground a way of thinking about functions of consciousness. I'm not going to go over the whole paper, just some thoughts from that paper. And then I want to kind of triangulate some results that come out of cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology to focus in on some questions that I think are interesting about the capacity for action planning and the role that theorizing about action planning might have in relationship to theorizing about functions of consciousness. It's going to remain fairly high level because I'm going to be drawing on a lot of studies all at once, so I won't be talking about any particular study or anything like that. And of course, this first part is based on joint work with Tim. So any mistakes in the ideas here goes. So Tim and I argue in that paper for taking seriously what we call a capacity-based approach to functions of consciousness. So this is connected to a general explanatory approach that's influential in philosophy of cognitive science, parts of psychology, not as influential in consciousness studies, but we think that it probably should be. So on this kind of approach, you start by understanding the mind as a kind of structured collection of capacities. And what capacities there are, how they're exercised, how they relate to consciousness. These are all substantive questions that require a lot of work to get clarity on. But you can start with intuitive examples just to try to understand the approach. So the capacity to see, the capacity to attend, the capacity to remember. You can start there and then try to move forward. When you understand the mind in terms of a structured collection of capacities, then you start to think, well, there's a lot of different ways that one capacity can relate to another. So I'll just mention some examples. Some capacities kind of presuppose others. They require these others to work. So capacity for visual perception seems to presuppose capacities that are related to things like edge detection, motion perception, object tracking, these kinds of things. Some capacities seem to enable other capacities. So, I mean, arguably, this is just drawing on some work by Susan Carey. The capacity to use external symbols, represent serial order, might enable a bootstrapping process that explains our particular human capacity to develop sophisticated numerical cognition. Some capacities will relate to other capacities as enhancers. Think of a lot of different examples for ways that one capacity might enhance another or a set of other capacities. Some capacities will relate to other capacities as inhibitors. Perhaps speech production inhibits verbal working memory. And of course, given the way that there are going to be gradations in the way that different capacities relate to each other, probably predict that some capacities would partially inhibit other capacities. So there's just a wide range of different kinds of relationships that are relevant to understanding how one particular capacity fits into the mind at a very abstract level. Okay, so on a capacity-based conception, which is initially just a way to begin theorizing about the mind, very abstract way, it might be initially unclear how consciousness fits in to that, right? Amin Thompson doesn't have anything to do with consciousness. I'm just kind of a funeral for the Houston Rockets season. So don't worry about the photos. So we can ask, is the property of being conscious, itself a capacity? That might be one way to fit consciousness into a capacity-based approach. And this way of thinking is plausible, I think, if you want to talk about global states of consciousness. Sometimes people talk about levels of consciousness. This way of thinking might be relevant to the state of waking awareness or something like that, creature consciousness. You might think of it in this kind of way. That's one way, and I don't mean to rule that out. Another way to try and understand how consciousness might fit into a capacity-based approach is to say, look, it looks like consciousness might show up in a wide range of ways across different operations of different sorts of capacities. So consciousness might show up in the operations of metacognition, olfaction, motor control, whatever. And it might show up in different ways. Okay, so on this picture, you might think, well, perhaps consciousness modulates, where modulation comes in many different ways, might modify and regulate, might integrate the use of different kinds of capacities. Okay. There's another issue here when you start to think about this more specific way of trying to think about how consciousness might be involved in the operation of different capacities. There's a generic property, being conscious, that's relevant. We can think about that. But we might also need to consider the role that's played by various determinate states of consciousness, being perceptually conscious or being conscious of the color or something. Okay. So on this kind of approach, properly identifying the mind's key capacities is going to be grounded in this further task of explaining how these capacities operate. And this is where functions for us, for Tim and I, enter the picture. So functions we're thinking of as causal roles that are played by parts of a system, and they enter into explanations of how capacities work when they work. So these causal roles, when you put them together in the right way, will let us lay out, explain how some capacity operates. So how some system enables seeing or edge detection or motion attribution or whatever your target of interest is. And this can be connected, I won't talk much about this, but this can be connected to a kind of mechanistic decomposition strategy that Carl Kramer's made really philosophy of science, if you want to do that. Okay, so the capacity-based kind of account or approach asks this kind of question. So for any given capacity, pick whatever one you like, what relations, things like enabling, enhancing, inhibiting, does some aspect of consciousness have for that capacity? So if you think of things in this way, then it starts to look like possibly the functions of consciousness are going to be really diverse, because the capacities and causal roles that make up the mind are diverse and very plentiful. Okay, and I think it's important, at least for this approach, for Tim and I, that we're relativizing claims about the functions of consciousness in many different ways. So not just the particular types of conscious systems, but to different aspects of consciousness. This is, I think, consistent or can be made consistent with Dillon's approach, which he calls functional pluralism. This is kind of quoted from this paper of Dillon's, where it says, pluralism is this thought that consciousness occupies a variety of different functional roles across different task domains, individuals, and species. So if you think of things in this way, these are only some of the questions that emerge. There's a number of questions that emerge. So you can ask, is there structure amongst the multiple causal roles that aspects of consciousness might play? Does this structure cluster together in interesting ways? Why or why not? This is kind of connected or can be connected to an approach to understanding consciousness that Tim Bain with Nick Shea and some others have worked on, called the natural kind approach. The question is consciousness a natural kind? And how might the science of consciousness help us get at that kind of question? This capacity-based approach isn't taking a stand on whether consciousness is a natural kind, although it does dovetail in some ways with that approach in ways that we think might be fruitful. We can ask, are there particular capacities for which consciousness is important? Why might that be? Are there particular aspects of consciousness that are important for different kinds of behaviors? Why might that be? Is phenomenal consciousness a kind of disarrayed bag of various causal roles, or is there something kind of structurally unifying about it? And what might that thing be? Again, I don't know. This is just like how one might think about functions of consciousness, not to say what the functions are. Okay, so that's just some general thoughts about the kind of approach that I'd like to take in thinking about the functions of consciousness. What I want to say now in the rest of the talk is talk about some research that seems to suggest that different aspects of consciousness feed into a capacity that needs to be better theorized. In part of my life, I'm a philosopher of action. This is something I've cared about for a long time. But in cognitive science, capacity for action planning shows up in different ways across different literatures and experimental paradigms. And so I want to suggest that this is at least a fruitful area to look and to try to see how different research programs feed into the same kind of idea. Okay, so I'm going to talk, kind of draw on 3 different papers that are kind of position papers that review a lot of literature and make a few statements. One of them is this paper by Steve Fleming and Matthias, really excellent paper. It's coming out in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Sensory horizons and the functions of conscious vision. I'm only going to go over just a little bit of it. I know Matthias isn't going to talk about this paper. I don't think he's talking, but I didn't want to step on his toes too much or anything. Really interesting paper with some proposals about the functions of conscious vision. And one of the main things that drives their argument in this paper is the thought that conscious vision is slow in the sense that the emergence into conscious awareness of visual perception takes some time. There's kind of processing lag from the stimulus being presented and that thing showing up. And there's lots of different ways to kind of make the case. They discuss a lot of evidence that I'm not going to discuss, but one thing they appeal to is postdictive effects. So postdiction is the thought that the way one consciously perceives a stimulus presented at a particular time is going to change because of events that happen after that time. And they might happen 100 milliseconds after that time, 200 milliseconds after that, 300 milliseconds, whatever. A lot of different ways to study postdiction. A lot of work has been done. So they appeal to some work that suggests that if you show a vernier and an anti-vernier at 450 milliseconds after the initial stimulus, that will change the appearance of the whole visual stream. So that's a pretty big window for a postdictive effect happening. And they reason as follows. This is a quote from their paper. They say, these effects, and by these, it's a lot more than just that paper, but I'm trying to move a little bit quickly. These kind of postdictive effects suggest that conscious perception doesn't generally occur for 350 milliseconds after stimulus onset. If conscious perception occurred before that, manipulating post-stimulus process, it would be too late to change it. The fact that the fate of a percept can still be changed in that time frame indicates it's not already conscious. This means that consciousness is slow. It's preceded by a window of unconscious sensory integration. It can last for 450 milliseconds in the most extreme cases. Okay, interesting claim. Not just due to some processing limitations. So one interesting aspect of their paper is they suggest that this window of temporal integration might be somewhat flexible. And this might be connected to something that the mind is doing all the time, important for us navigating our worlds. That's reality. So reality monitoring is this capacity to determine whether internal signals reflect external reality or endogenous activity uncoupled from sensory input. Trying to figure out what's out there versus what's happening inside, and they connect the function of conscious vision to this further capacity of reality monitoring. So in their view, reality monitoring is looking for the reliability of different kinds of signals in different kinds of ways. And they say, given this window of temporal integration, whenever a signal might be judged reliable enough, the monitoring system closes the window of integration, settles on an interpretation of what's happening out there at that time. Okay, and so that might be somewhat flexible for different reasons. Interestingly, kind of want to talk with all of y'all, but Matthias and Steve as well, more about this. They connect this reality monitoring function to model-based control, where model-based control is a form of kind of action planning that involves working through models in the environment that might involve your goals and your likelihood to succeed, this kind of thing. They point out such control can involve what they call online planning that's achieved through rapid simulation of future sensory states, where the simulation is often not conscious. But also, it can involve a slower, much more deliberate thought. And so there's this question that I have about how to think about this kind of model-based control when it can involve timescales that are very different. It might involve conceptual resources that are very different. It might involve simulation processes in one instance. It might involve conceptual reasoning and inference in other instances. Are these things unified as a single capacity, or is there really different forms of planning that different aspects of consciousness might feed into? I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. So they argue that reality monitoring and this capacity for model-based planning are deeply intertwined. I find that plausible. They also argue that this provides insight into why visual consciousness may have evolved. And I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to point out, in their paper, they kind of talk about functions of consciousness in two different ways, which is fine, because I think it's fine to think about both of them. This claim about why consciousness may have evolved, you can understand the claim about what's sometimes called the right functions of consciousness. That is a function that says this trait is here because it does this other thing, or plays this role. And this trait is here because this role is useful over evolutionary time. It's a way to use right functions to explain evolution. Cummins functions is kind of what Tim and I had in mind in our paper, and kind of what I'm talking about today, although I'm happy to think about both. So a Cummins function is just a causal role that some aspect of the mind is playing at a time for capacity. Okay, because exaptation might occur in evolutionary time. Right functions and Cummins functions aren't exactly the same thing. Something could have a Cummins function, but that's not why it's there over the time scale. But you can see how they can relate to each other, and you might ultimately want an explanation of how both types of functions relate to each other, especially regarding consciousness. So I think what consciousness does for us now, interesting question, why consciousness or any aspect of consciousness like vision might have emerged in our evolutionary ancestors, also an interesting question, just a different question. Okay, so that's some thoughts about conscious vision connected to reality monitoring that feeds in an interesting way to what Steve and Matthias call model-based control. I want now to say a little bit about proprioception. This is a recent review paper by Thor Grunbaum, Mark Christensen, talking about the conscious sensation of movement and its function. One of the things they say early on in the paper is this, and I think it's an interesting thing to point out in a paper. Almost all contemporary theories and controversies of consciousness concern visual consciousness. Important issues like neural location, role of attention, processing latencies, framed in terms of visual processing. The field of consciousness research has been characterized by an almost total neglect of conscious proprioception. So say Thor and Mark. But I think it's whether that's true or not, it's interesting to try and look at things like the conscious sensation of movement, which is informed by proprioception, and ask, how is it similar to vision in terms of lots of things? How might it differ? So for them, the sensation of movement comes in two forms, actually, and they argue it comes in two forms because you can generate it in two different ways. You can generate it in a passive way by manipulating afferent signals with muscle spindles and these kinds of things, or you can generate it just by getting people to try to do certain things. In these kind of legendary old studies where Simon Candavian and colleagues, not the only studies that did this, but they would give themselves neuromuscular blocks, or they would take vecuronium and they would be fully paralyzed, and they would lay in the lab and try to do things, try to move parts of their body. And then they would come out of this and they would report their experiences. This is like back in the 70s. So there's some newer experiments that try to get more precise. Of course, they were doing these experiments on themselves because I think it's hard to talk about that. But it looks like this is at least Grunbaum and Christensen, and I agree with them. There's maybe two different types of a sensation of movement experience. One is passive, as of the body moving, and the other is active, and this is where motor cortex is involved, as of moving the body. Important for thinking about what the sensation of movement is and how it might relate to other parts of the mind. So we can ask, what's the role of proprioception in action control? And one thing to look at when you think about proprioception and action control is deafferent patients, people that have lost proprioception. These people lose much of their ability to initiate and control their actions. So this is from the Grunbaum and Christensen paper. They say when you look at people who are deafferent, have no proprioception, they can't control things like the extent and vigor of movement. They can't focus on and activate individual muscle groups. They can, over time, with a lot of effort, reacquire certain capacities for moving themselves around. But they're often only able to move absent proprioception, often only able to move when vision gets into work, and a lot of it. So when they can focus visually on a part of their body, they begin to regain some control over it, but they lose the normal way that you and I move about the world. Ian Waterman's a famous example of this, and it's a quote from a book where Waterman figures pretty centrally. He says, I always have to think where I am, what I'm doing. I can never be completely absorbed. However beautiful the scene, I have to concentrate on what I'm doing. You might remember a walk with the views. I just remember the walking. I brought my kids to New York City, and they had never been to New York for a couple of days before this workshop, and this last line resonates with me. I don't remember the city at all. I just remember trying to keep my kids from that. Okay. So what's the time scale for proprioceptive signals to enter awareness? Interesting question, given Fleming and Michel and post-dictive work asking a similar kind of question for conscious vision. There's not nearly as much work on proprioception, and it's pretty hard. In fact, I'd be interested if anyone knows of really good work. I'm trying to use post-dictive effects with proprioception. Found a little bit, there's really not much that I was able to find. But if you look at other kinds of evidence for passive proprioception, you can start to find certain kinds of potential markers of consciousness, like a somatosensory negativity in EEG emerging at something like 125 milliseconds plus. There's reasons to think that might not be the most kind of precise measurement, but that's some of the stuff that's out there. Let me just say what Greenbaum and Christensen think as a kind of high level review point, looking at a lot of different studies. They think at the bottom of that quote, we should identify the conscious sensation of movement with a certain place in a computational hierarchy that is the estimated current state of the limb's position and direction. Okay, so current state estimation for them is going to draw on things like corollary discharge signals from a forward model, sensory feedback signals, error signals after you compare these things. That's the kind of, let's say, this kind of window where you get a lot of things feeding into this. There's a lot in the background, but you have certain kinds of error signals that might inform it, and corollary discharge that might inform it. But it's a kind of current state estimate. The relationship between this current state estimate of the limb and something like reality monitoring is something I'd be interested to think a lot more about. You're performing a little bit of a different task in that case than the case of vision, but we kind of have a kind of question here. Why do these proprioceptive signals become conscious? So it's been suggested that just like in the case of vision, some people argue for a dual stream model of vision where unconscious vision is really important for fine grained correction and motor control of movements. There's a second stream that's more important for higher level conscious vision and higher level cognitive functions. Some of think that's true for proprioception as well. So why think that proprioception kind of ever becomes conscious? They point to some interesting work here. This study by Arvazova and colleagues, pretty interesting to suggest that you can look at metacognition for proprioception and compare it to metacognition for vision in like a throwing task where you give people either visual feedback or no visual feedback. And people are pretty good at not only understanding exactly how they just move their arm in a kind of throwing task or a correction task, but also pretty good at metacognitive sensitivity to these kinds of judgments, independently of vision and with vision. In fact, the metacognitive sensitivity looks very similar across vision for proprioception. So it looks like there's similar access to this kind of thing. So that proprioceptive signals are conscious a lot of the time when we're acting. And so the speculation here from Greenbaum and Christensen is that while rapid error correction might bypass consciousness, in normal cases, we have a kind of possibly easily masked experience of movement that's part of a current state estimate and it can inform what they call motor planning. Okay. So model-based planning is what the Fleming and Michel paper was kind of locating as an important thing that conscious vision feeds into. They call it motor planning. I actually think these are terms that are used in different ways across literature. I think roughly the same thing. Okay. Now, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Cool. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'll go through this a little bit quickly, because I've talked about vision and proprioception. I now want to talk just a little bit about certain aspects of metacognition, particularly metacognitive feelings. So this is a paper of mine that's coming out in the Journal of Philosophy that's about the sense of agency, which is often said to be the experience of kind of controlling your body and changing things in the world via action. I won't talk about the sense of agency at all, but I think there's a kind of interesting role, this is my proposal, that certain metacognitive feelings play that's connected with what I call the cognitive control of action. And by cognitive control of action, I kind of just mean, I think, what Steve and Matthias mean by model-based planning and what Thor and Mark Christensen mean by motor planning. So I'll skip some of the stuff about the cognitive control of action, but I can talk about that later. So the picture that emerges from different literatures on motor control and motor planning is that actually cognitive control and decision making is really important even for low-level aspects of motor control. Obviously, some parts of motor control display kind of modularity. They're semi-independent, semi-autonomous from planning capacities. Motor adaptation displays an interesting form of semi-autonomy where motor adaptation is very sensitive to intentions and decisions that you take, but actually operates by its own principles and kind of correcting your movement, fine-graining your movement over short windows that can be set in the lab. Nonetheless, Decision making is from a recent review paper. Decision making in the context of action dynamically interacts with the sensory motor system at multiple levels. So cognitive control processes that underlie things like decision making, attention and vision, choice of cognitive strategies for doing things, are connected to behavior production by this dynamic flow of information that goes from planning capacities down to lower level motor adaptation, motor control mechanisms and capacities. Okay, why do I point that out? Well, this is where I think certain metacognitive processes and the conscious experiences that are associated with them may have a role to play in the control of action. And the proposal I'm making in this paper that's forthcoming is that there's two in particular. So you have metacognitive monitoring processes that are always monitoring your action options for quality and cost of what you might be deciding to do, how you might change your intention on the fly. So for any given action under consideration by the agent, in working memory, possibly in kind of unconscious simulation of the sort that Fleming and Michelle talked about, there's a representation of the quality of that action. I think this is a model-free kind of representation that's scaled in analog magnitude way, but it's not super important for today. So metacognitive monitoring of what I call action quality is connected to a space of feelings that might accurately be called feelings of fluency, feelings of control, feelings of reliability. I think it's maybe even similar to feelings of confidence, but it's connected to this representation of quality. There's a second dimension of these metacognitive feelings that has to do with cost. So that has to do with the resources the behavior utilizes, and there's a lot of different methods of assessment for this. So energy expenditure, amount of working memory resources allocated, time on task, so on. I think this dimension is connected to feelings that might be called feelings of effort, feelings of difficulty, feelings of strain. There's a big literature now on cognitive effort that taps into what's going on here. So here's one thing I say in the paper. You've got these different metacognitive feelings that are connected to these representations that are monitoring cost and quality. These things might work in relatively habitual ways. That is to say, these feelings dispose you to act in certain ways or to decide in certain ways in the same way that lots of valence signals might do. But there's a possibility that even though these metacognitive signals are kind of model-free, more sophisticated agents, like human adults that have time in an active domain to develop skills, might build models of the performance of different cognitive control strategies, which are informed by these metacognitive signals. So in some domains, and given enough time, we might be able to explicitly weigh these kinds of signals of quality and effort. So it's taking up the conscious experience as a kind of information to inform decision making. And we can use these things to like override them if need be. So, if you're jet lagged and you're tired, it's going to be really effortful to kind of work further on your talk. And normally you just opt out, and you might think, oh, it's really important to make sure my talk is vaguely coherent. I'm going to override effortful decision, just get it done. Okay. It's giving us greater flexibility in how we deploy cognitive control with it. So just to conclude, I think it's natural to think that there's something kind of potentially very interesting about the ways that all these different aspects of consciousness, you can at least make a theoretical case, feed into something like our capacity for action planning. So talk about vision, proprioception, and certain metacognitive feelings. How exactly they feed in, I think depends a lot on how we theorize what I've just vaguely called this capacity for action planning. Some people call cognitive control, what some people call working memory resources, what some people call motor planning, some people call model-based planning. And so I think that there's kind of two things going on here. One is it's really hard to theorize about the functions of consciousness, but I've suggested a kind of approach for doing so. And the other is it's really hard to theorize about action planning, how action planning might relate to these different aspects of consciousness. But I'm wanting to put my finger on that and say I think there might be something worth thinking a lot more about in that space. So, okay, next. Josh? Yeah.
Oh, great talk, thank you so much. The risk of sounding perhaps, are you familiar with the ATP? Because that the cost versus quality that you seem to be talking about is theorized under expected free energy. And one of the things that you mentioned was the study about paralysis and how it does to have the sense that you want to have agency, or at least the drive towards motivated action, but then no subsequent action. And the difference between that and an active type of proprioception where it's, or passive type of proprioception where you're actually moving, and I feel like the distinction between the feeling of agency would be precisely in what you highlighted, and ultimately, the problem with that metric is something that's still not solved in the MPP, but could be furthered by your thoughts, is ultimately agency is not just an internal feeling, it is a profound relationship to the environment, but it is also that feeling and that internal decision. And so it has to transcend the relationship between the subject and the objects around it. And so the problem with it is that ultimately the rating could derive expected free energy is always related to the internal predictions of the individual. So there's still this lack of like, okay, but did you actually affect the environment, and how does that factor into those computations?
Good, so I don't want to, at this point, especially kind of rule or leave off the table any potential explanatory resource, you know? So if free energy minimization or predictive processing is able to give us some purchase on different sorts of capacities, or how consciousness gets involved in those capacities, I'm all ears in a way. In that Grunbaum and Christensen paper that I talked about, they actually, I just mentioned this because you might find it interesting, they contrast the kind of comparator model-based approach to the sensation of movement and motor control with a predictive processing model, looking for overall kind of a holistic explanatory virtues of both approaches. And they kind of conclude that they think the comparator model does better on a few metrics, but that both are fully on the table and worth looking at. So I would think that when it comes to thinking about sense of agency or sensation of movement or any aspect of consciousness that's more interested in function, one thing to do is think about, well, what are the models in the background that are useful for kind of explaining that sort of capacity? Can we do it all under a kind of predictive processing group? I know some people want to argue that that's true, and I'm kind of here for that debate, in part because where my focus is with this issue is at a level that's a little more abstract and committing to a specific approach.
Thanks. I was wondering that it seems that you were suggesting that in order for us to explain motor planning or action planning, sometimes we have to posit this role for conscious signals, and that they feed into this planning process. And I was wondering, why would that be a matter of feeling? It seems that all I need is that, well, there is some information about what I'm doing currently. And why would the feeling aspect be explanatory relevant at all? If all I need is just some information, why would that information being accompanied by some feeling be important at all?
Good. So I don't want to make any claims about like necessity in this context. So I don't want to say that kind of consciousness or the feeling aspect is necessary for explaining motor planning. What I do want to say is that's a big picture kind of issue that runs very deep, and I don't have a special response to it. My own kind of preference would be to understand consciousness, at least in part, in terms of representational content or representational format. And so the feeling, the fact that it is a feeling, the fact that it has a valence, the fact that it appears in the kind of way that it does, in the time that it does, is connected to the representational story you're going to tell about it. If there's a further question, but why is it conscious at all? Great question. But that's not an issue that I'm here trying to address. But even the thing that I just said about I would want to think about the representational story you would tell, I understand that that's itself controversial. That's just would be the way I would want to start.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be worth distinguishing between the core function of consciousness and functions that are associated with consciousness, especially in this context. So, for example, the core function of my heart is to pump blood, but then there are many functions that are associated with that.
Yeah.
Maybe that are enabled by my heart pumping blood, and so on and so forth. In the same way, I was thinking that in the context of the planning story you're giving, you might distinguish between the core function of consciousness, and you might distinguish between two hypotheses. One being that the core function of consciousness is to plan Another one, which I think would be my favorite hypothesis, would be that the core function of consciousness is to metacognize, and then you need that for efficient planning. Here's one reason why you might think that. Suppose that I want to plan how to go back to the hotel or something. One way of doing it is to fly. But of course, I have a good metacognitive sense that I can't do that. So oftentimes, in order to plan efficiently, you need to know what you can and cannot do. And so if you think that the core function of consciousness is metacognition, you should also think that that in turn enables some kind of efficient planning capacities.
So I think distinguishing between core and just associated functions potentially very useful. Yes, I don't disagree with anything you said. Question I have about that is, what are we saying when we're saying core function? Is it to say just most central causally? Is it the reason that it evolved? There's different ways to cash out core. So if I had a theory, which I don't, of what the core function of consciousness was, that would be the further. Actually, I want to hear more about what you think about what it means to say something's core. Do you mean necessary?
No, I don't mean necessary. I think that if functionalism is true, and it is, that's going to be functions that you can implement in a system. That's going to make it the case, given some background predictions made, that the system is going to turn out conscious.
Okay.
That's what I mean by
Okay.
the core function.
Okay.
It's the function consciousness is.
So yeah, there's a lot to say about that. Well, in part because there's an interesting issue that's in the background here when we're talking about functions, talking about what consciousness does, and you want that to give you insight into what consciousness is, but it might not, especially if you get the core functions wrong or you just identify some causal role. You can't expect that to give you full insight or even any insight in some cases into what actually consciousness is. So these two things are not exactly the same, and you want them ideally to start to come together.
So what it is will be necessary and sufficient for what it is.
What?
So what it is will be necessary and sufficient for what it is. It sounds like you're embracing necessary attributes.
It's dangerous.
It's not related to the comment from just before, but so when you say model based, to what degree do you mean like an imaginative simulation of actually counterfactual actions and they're like the causal relations, or it could be also like model based in terms of maybe so it does involve that's like something like purely verbal semantic, and that's like giving you a structured model, but maybe without imagination, maybe it's very within Fantasia or something, what's the range of what you have in mind for model based and simulated, is there potentially a core relationship to something like imagination or simulation of counterfactual states or not?
So it's a good question when you say model based, what is the nature of the model, how rich is it, that kind of thing. I wouldn't want there to be a necessary connection to imagery or to imagination necessarily, although that's all how it gets talked about. I think something like a knowledge of possibilities, knowledge of the possibility space, there's sense of possibility is important. Because you are working through something like hypothetical scenarios when you deploy that model. That's why it's useful, because one of the reasons, because it provides a certain form of flexibility and understanding what the kind of option space is.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned some functions like active vision or some higher up functions like attention or cognitive control. And I think it's very common for people to have impaired such functions with if you have impaired vision or if you have ADHD, so you have impaired attention issue or a cognitive control issue and such things like that. And obviously, if we have impaired functions like these, we are still conscious. But then I think it's also natural to claim that we have a narrower phenomenal consciousness. We're less conscious. So my question is, to what extent can we classify consciousness as a continuous variable instead of a discrete or binary variable?
Interesting question. I think there's an issue here of the aspects of consciousness that are under consideration in any given case. So we can ask, what happens when you lose proprioception and also thereby conscious proprioception. That's focusing on one particular thing. You can ask that about a lot of different aspects of consciousness. You can also try to look much bigger picture and say, what about phenomenal consciousness or just consciousness? And that's a different question because it's collects underneath itself all these different kinds of aspects which may have different causal roles. So to what extent consciousness is, and then in this way of thinking, kind of a variable under consideration. It's often not. You're often relativizing the claims to some aspect of consciousness, and I think it's too quick to say, oh, so we've learned something about the kind of phenomenal consciousness on the whole. You want to get there, but I think it's too quick to just move from specific studies about vision or something like that. But it's about phenomenology.
Thanks, Josh, for the talk. I wanted to call back. You mentioned a call out for specific work on proprioception,
Yeah.
sort of sensory motor control. I want to take us back to the pastiche question of machines and translatability to machines. So if you had a machine system, like an unmanned autonomous system, like a ground vehicle or an air vehicle, that were to sustain enough damage to independently make a decision that it were going to return to base, as opposed to something like it sustained damage and it had like a pre-programmed routine that gave it those instructions versus iteratively recursively applied. I'm kind of curious whether your research interests are sort of like open and neutral for sort of translating functions of consciousness to these types of machines, whether they're altogether unfriendly on the basis of the fact that like it's hard to say that something like a vest or a shirt that took those holes wasn't relying on the human's ability to propriocept in order to get out of the combat zone.
I mean, I am going to be initially kind of neutral on that. I think it's so here's one way you might think of it. We're very particular kinds of systems that come into this world given a really rich and bizarre history that we only understand part of. And you can build a kind of full I mean, we can't now, but you can build a kind of full functional story about how we work in these different kinds of ways. And then you can think about how that translates to machines, things that we engineer and design. And in some cases, there's going to be a lot of insight and kind of trying to do that translation. In other kinds of cases, I think you probably should leave the question of kind of consciousness, at least from a design perspective, behind. So there might be a much better way, given the different materials that we're using to build these machines. It's just a much better way to do it. There's, of course, when you get a sophisticated machine up and running, we've all learned recently, there's going to be lots of questions that get asked about consciousness and that kind of machine, and that's great. But this is meant to initially approach things from an animal perspective. Let's try to understand how animals are conscious, including humans. But yeah, I think the translation issues are like really rich.
Okay, and Paul is getting the last question. Paul and Dave.
So this is mostly just clarificatory. I was thinking like with the focus on model-based learning, like with an implication of the speed that we kind of like see the capacity of counterfactual reasoning as a sort of like sign of consciousness in animals. So like would we want to say that sort of the animals that can engage in sort of vicarious sort of trial and error imagination be the ones that we should expect to be conscious, or is that not a sort of identity you want to make based on what you've said so far?
That's one place to go.
Yeah.
I would be reticent to do that, at least quickly, because I'm trying to relativize claims about functions to systems. And as soon as you change the parameter of the system, as soon as you move from humans to canines or whatever, I at least want to take account of the differences and not just think, well, just because this capacity looks very similar to ours, consciousness is just to be associated with that capacity. That said, yeah, I think in general it seems very intuitive. We can find counterfactual reasoning and those sorts of things in another animal. You're really tempted to attribute consciousness, but I mean that's an intuition I have, and I just kind of think I want to do the work of kind of trying to understand how that system is working and how it relates to the history of that animal before I would be like really confidently.
Version of the same question I asked to the villain, which is a lot of these functions look like potential functions of access consciousness. So here's a view about whether these are functions of access consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, or both.
I don't have a view. I think it's pretty clear that access is involved in these things. So if you want to distinguish access and phenomenal in a clean way based on the things that I'm saying, you're not going to do it. So I kind of think that everything I've said just leaves that issue with us right in front of us.